the first solution is how to cope with those people who doesn't want to be Muslim or Jew. The first one, servitude and humiliation. Jews is a necessary evil, an error in the service of truth. And this is St. Augustine, wrote that the Jews should be not killed, but condemned to dispersion and humiliation as a sign of the church victory over the synagogue. It's a kind of condemnation to eternal servitude that will be maintained for centuries. It means that it's going to be like, as long as we have to convert the pagans, by putting them, the Jews, in servitude, it's a way to say the cost of not being a Christian, in a sense, also. And it's going to be connected to a myth that it's the wandering Jews. The fact that the Jews are cursed and they won't be able to go back to Israel, for instance. And if I ask you, who was the last state of Europe to recognize the state of Israel, do you think? What?
Vatican.
The Vatican. And this is why. Because if you recognize Israel, it means that maybe St. Augustine was wrong. There was no curse on the Jewish people, etc. This is a very famous, one of the very famous images of the wandering Jews. It was a film, 1926. So, solution 2 is criminalization. It was an easy way to criminalize the Jews, and the Jew says, well, they tried to kill the Christ, and I will go back to this. And for the Muslim, in a sense, it's certain tradition, that Muhammad was poisoned by his last wife. And this is a way to criminalize the Jews. The solution 3, and this is important, is the Christian will invent what is called theology of substitution. Okay, there was a link between the Jews and God, but now it's caduc, it's finished, it's ended. The new Jewish people is the church, the new Jerusalem is Rome or Constantinople or Moscow, the new sacred language is no more Hebrew, is Greek or Latin or Russian, etc. And this is the way. Substitution. We, the Christian, we substitute the Jews. And this is a way, to go beyond the neurosis. You deny. And even you forget that Jesus was a Jew. This is a good example of theology of substitution. This is in Strasbourg Cathedral. It's called the Victory of the Church over the Synagogue, and you can see how the synagogue looks like. It's a beautiful lady, even more, I think, more sexy than the Christian lady, I would say, but she's blind. She's in error. She did recognize that Jesus was the Messiah announced by the Torah. The spear is broken. It means the alliance is caduc, it's finished. And then the Torah is still there. It will be called the Old Testament, but still is there. But it's an appendix to the real gospel. And this is typical, and you will find hundreds of representations like this in many churches and cathedrals all over Europe. People couldn't read, and it was a way to understand. Another example is this beautiful painting that you will find in Madrid, in Le Prado, by the Flemish painter Van Eyck. It's called The Victory of Christianity over the Judaism. And then you will see what? Well, you can't see very well. But anyway, this is a detail, it's of the painting. And you can see the Jews, actually they look like Flemish people. They dress like Flemish people. But you can see they are Jews because of their special hats. But you see, they don't want to listen to the good news, etc. They are in the error. And what is important to show this also, and this is anti-Judaism. This is not anti-Semitism. In anti-Judaism, there is a salvation way for the Jews. It's conversion. They still are human beings. What you don't like in the human being is that he is a Jew. But you can leave your Judaism when becoming a Christian. In anti-Semitism, what you don't like in the Jew is that the fact is a human being, so you have to kill the Jews. This is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, etc. So, third solution, this was the Muslim response to the same neurotic problem, the dissonance cognitive, and it's going to be theology of falsification. Contrary to the Christian, you do not consider that there was an alliance between Jewish people and God. You believe that the Torah and the Gospel has been falsified, that the real Torah, the real Gospel, they announced already Muhammad, and that the Quran was even written before the Torah, and that all the the prophet, they were already Muslim. That Abraham was a Muslim, etc., and even Isa, Jesus, and Jesus being a kind of precursor, the last prophet before the last messenger, who is Muhammad, etc. And this is an example of the fact that some doctors, not all of them, of Muslim faith, believe that it was in fact not Isaac but Ishmael who was almost killed by his father. The first consequence is, and this is important also, because the Jews will have a special status without Islam and Christianity, the Jews are totem and taboo. They're not only taboo, they are also totem. It's the first, people who had a special relationship with God. But they are envied, how would you pronounce this? Envied, thanks. Despised and humiliated, but still sacred and useful. Why useful? And this is also important. Ernest Gellner, the famous sociologist actually who teach here, he invented the castration, and Jews were a castrated, class or caste. They were useful to the medieval or the feudal, society as middleman minority, because, in traditional society, you need people like the Jews or like priests who couldn't have children, or like, minorities whatsoever. Sometimes it's going to be the Chinese or Indian. You need those kind of minorities. And the Jews were very useful to avoid any kind of, I would say, revolution within your own people. So the Jews were tertiary sector embryo. In the High Middle Age, Jews were tolerated because they were useful. Living as they did at the margins of society, Jews performed economic functions that were vital to the pre-modern feudal society. And this explains why you cannot really find traces of what I will call antisemitism according to my definition, or even pogroms or massacre before the Crusades. They were useful to the feudal society. Everything will change around 1100. Consequence 2. Hence, the Jews are going to constitute the only minority tolerated within Christian and Muslim state, especially the Maghreb, and to become gradually the usual suspect and ideal scapegoat. Any society needs to find within itself the reason of the what went wrong, and of course it's going to be the only minority, and it's going to be the Jews. Conclusion. It is exactly in this double context, theological, totem and taboo, and sociological, only tolerated minority, that the Jews are gradually being assigned a triple role: religious, the Jews as witness and curse; economic, the Jews as foreign and economical agent; and finally, the Jews as an outlet to internal crisis, the scapegoat. It's logical. And so, on this religious hostility, set up gradually as a cultural call, will arise at first traditional anti-Judaism, then modern anti-Semitism, then, by a tortuous one and complex progress, the Nazi anti-Semitism, and finally, vicarious return of the history, current news Judeophobia called radical anti-Zionism. And I will try to speak about this. What is important is you shouldn't confuse between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. What is anti-Judaism? It's a rational opposition. You dislike the Jews for what they are, Jews, for what they believe. They do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. You don't like them because they have they rest their weekends on Shabbos and not on Friday or Sunday. And this shows that the pivotal status of the Judaism, if you consider, and in a sense it's normal, that monotheist religions are intolerant by definition. The worst war is between also brothers and sisters, between Shiites and Sunnites, between Protestant and Catholic, between Jews and Samaritans. You know, Jesus, who only met Jews, he found a good Samaritan. It means a lot. A good Samaritan. Because according to the Jews then, Samaritans were hatred. That's why only 1,000 of them are left also. So the quarrel is theological. You don't like Judaism. And on the whole, logic, if we think about the exclusivism of the monotheist faith. But there is one thing which announced anti-Semitism, and this is the myth of Judah, you know, the one who is supposed to have betrayed Jesus. Because we know that the Romans are responsible of Jesus' death, not the Jews. And I will show you how you can show it, that this is maybe the first fake news of history. And you can see already that, you can't see it very well, unfortunately, but you can see already how Jesus will be more and more, he will look more and more like an Aryan, if it exists, it doesn't, and Judah more and more like a Jew. And of course, it's very useful. Judah means a Jew. So Jew betrayed Jesus. The problem is that all those people there around the Last Supper, they're all Jews. You can't find any non-Jews. But of course, it's so convenient to say that Judah betrayed Jesus. And this is Jean Chrysostom, and he said the Jews did slay Christ, you did lift violent hands against the master, you did spill this precious blood, this is why you have no chance for atonement, excuse, or defense. And this is very useful, this is very clever, because they had to convert the Romans. You couldn't say to the Romans, you kill our gods. So you have to make the Romans innocent, and so you have to say that the Jews are responsible, and it's good, because you want to destroy Judaism, because you are the new, etc. And this is Middle Age representation that you can't see so well. In my computer it's better. And then you see that actually the one, you know, who slain Jesus are not the Roman legionaries. The Jews, you can see on the hats. And this is very interesting. This is the first Jewish conspiracy. Why? Because you see that Jewish people are giving Jesus to, who is this man? Ponce Pilate. And how is Ponce Pilate represented? He's a Jew. Ponce Pilate, the Roman, is a Jew. And what is important, it's a conspiracy. And who is this man? It's Judah. And how could we know it? He sell it for money. So it's a Jewish conspiration for money. And this explains also a lot. Anti-Semitism has cultural, religious roots. This is another example. Everyone knows that he was, you know, slain by Romans, and those actually, they were Jews. And this is a good example, 13th century in England, and this is really, you know, how finally this is a transformation. How look how Jesus is represented, like a beautiful British citizen, and look the Jews, and look even Ponce Pilate. Ponce Pilate is being a Jew. And you understand the importance of this myth. And this is a fake news. And the problem is, you know, in political science, what's important? It's not the reality, but what you believe the reality is, the representation of the reality. If you believe this, well, you become an anti-Semite, etc. But still, difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So, well, let's go to anti-Semitism. So, contrary to what people believe, of course, the word is being invented in the 19th century. Anti-Semitism. Okay, it's a 19th century word, but it doesn't mean you cannot use it for previous, you know, time. The same thing, for instance, with genocide, invented in 1942 by Lemkin, and we speak about the genocide of Armenia, 1915. The same thing, we speak about the assassination of Julius Caesar. The concept of assassination, it's from, you know, the Arabic, it's ashashin. So it means, who cares? According to most of the medieval historians, like Langmuir, Giovanni Nicoli in Italy, anti-Semitism is 13th, 12th century, not 19th century. It depends how you define it. If you define anti-Semitism as the fact that you don't only despise the Jews, oh, you despise them, of course, but you fear the Jews. Anti-Semitism is the fear of the Jews. They are extremely powerful. Why they're powerful? Because they are connected to the evil. So they can destroy. Even if they are 1%, they can destroy you. And this is a fear. It's a social paranoia. And this is the 13th century, where everything will start it. And you will see what does it mean. There is a difference. The hatred of the Jews born in the wake of the Crusades is still religiously inspired, but distinguishes itself from it by its totally irrational side. The hatred is no more doctrinal, but of a fantastical order. You don't despise the Jews for what they are, but for what they are not. They don't hate, the humankind. They don't kill children. They don't poison the, etc. They don't bring disease, etc. And this is anti-Semitism. From then, anti-Semitism is already essentially a social construction. Neurosis turns into psychosis. Why? And one of the reason is economically. It's the misfortune of the Jews as a middleman minority. They're not useful anymore. In Flanders, in Italy, you have local bourgeoisie or in Spain, who wanted to get the position that were given to the Jews in the feudal society. So we don't need them anymore. And if you don't want your dog, you will say he has the rage, of course. And this is the problem of the Jews. And so it means they were envied, and so it's going to be the Crusades. The Christians were supposed, to take back the Holy Land to the Muslim, and then some priest says, okay, we have to fight the infidels. Well, so it's okay. We have to fight the infidels, but we have infidels without us, without our society, and they are even worse than the Muslim because they killed the Christ. So the first massacre of the Crusades, as you know, were the Jewish community along the Rhine. 10,000 Jews were killed. And it's a major cultural shift. That's why I insist anti-Semitism is a medieval concept, but late medieval concept. Full-scale persecution, many places, with special accusation. So as I said, the Jews, and it's not Judaism anymore, it's the Jews who are hatred, etc. They are despised, they are hatred for not what they are, but what they are supposed to be, and they are becoming responsible of the misfortune of the world. This is my definition of anti-Semitism, and it's going to be, again, wow, okay. Jews were burned because of, and you will find, and this is really the beginning. You can't find, traces of persecution like this before the Crusaders period and the economical revival. That's why I say crisis, but also mutation. Some example you can find, Jews being, with very strange accusation. You know what this accusation is? That the Jews were supposed to, to desecrate the Holy Host, etc. Because, they're bleeding, because it's the Christ, actually. And this is a representation in Belgium, in the main cathedral of Brussels, where O Kings are crowned. And it was created on the side where Jews were burned in 1370, because they were supposed to have, destroyed. Okay, mais c'est vraiment... this is a... So, and the most, the worst accusation of this period will be, blood libel and ritual murder. And the first occurrence actually is in England, in Norwich, 1144. You can't find any example, well, in Alexandria, but it was much earlier, but it means in the Christian era, it's 1144, the first time the Jews were accused of, of having killed a child. And between 1144 till 1946 in Kielce, Poland, you will find around 200, cases of fake accusation against the Jews. And most of the children, supposedly killed by Jews will be, if not beatified, they will be sanctified. And the main one will be, what his name is, of course, it's Simon of Trento. And this is an example of Simon of Trento. And he will be, and this is example, you will find, hundreds. And so it means that the Jews, they are doomed. You know the difference, this is the difference between, if you can see, the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. This is not anti-Judaic way of exposing the Jews. This is anti-Semitic. The Jew, they are connected to the devil. Wow, it's so modern.
And throughout church history, there is this anxiety about Jewish exceptionalism. Luther continues, Dear Moses, what do you mean? Luther starts out by quoting something from Deuteronomy in which Moses tells the people of Israel that they should circumcise their hearts. So Luther says, well, what does that mean? Meaning, if you're circumcising your heart, then you don't have to circumcise your flesh. Does it not suffice that they are circumcised physically? They are set apart from all other nations by this holy circumcision and made a holy people of God. And you rebuke them for stubbornness against God. You belittle their holy circumcision. You revile the holy circumcised people of God. It's very strong reading here. You should venture to talk like that today in their synagogues. If there were not stones conveniently near, they would resort to mud and dirt to drive you from their midst, even if you were worth 10 Moseses. What is Luther saying? Why is Moses a good guy, according to Luther?
Moses understood in rebuking the Jewish people to circumcise their heart that was what was most important. And Moses here is represented as having a kind of knowledge that the Jews themselves didn't have.
By virtue of such futile, arrogant circumcision in the flesh, they presume to be God's only people until the foreskin of their heart has become thicker than an iron mountain. That's a lot of metaphors there, right? And they can no longer hear, see, or feel their own clear scripture, which they read daily with blind eyes, overgrown with a pelt thicker than the bark of an oak tree. I didn't know Luther was such a poetic figure. But again, we see this sense of anxiety in relationship to Jewish particularism. I think Luther calls in the Jews in their lives for the burning down of synagogues. Meaning for Luther, the very presence of the Jew is problematic. Are there any historians, what Luther says here about Jews converting Christians, how common was that? I can't imagine very common, right? So you see that kind of anxiety and this creating of a threat that doesn't even really exist. Okay. Can I just take a 30-second break? I do this in my classes all the time. Yeah, it's okay? We can do that? You can stretch also? I make a distinction between stretching breaks, bathroom breaks, and coffee breaks. This is a stretching break. Okay. Okay. Who here has read Paradise Lost? Oh, so it's such an educated group of people. Nobody ever raises their hand when I say this. Not even my students, unfortunately, when we're reading it. See this, I can tell when I put the poetry on the board, people are getting like yawning and feeling bored, but this is for me the exciting part, right? So we'll read a little poetry, and then we'll come to 20th century anti-Semitism, stuff that's much more directly in our purview. So this is Milton's famous invocation to Paradise Lost. In writing Paradise Lost, Milton is claiming a kind of holy inspiration, which of course is an enormous amount of chutzpah, right? And while Homer, in his epics, calls out to the 9 muses, Milton on several occasions will call out to his muse, but his muse is a little bit different than the muse of the Homeric works. So, 26 lines. We'll read them a bit at a time. Of man's first disobedience in the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden. What are the first 4 lines characterized by? First 4.5 lines? It's actually after Genesis. I mean, it's the text Genesis, right? It's Adam and Eve having fall. It's a bummer here, right? Disobedience, mortality, death, woe, loss. Now the Christian kicker, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Who's the one greater man? Jesus. Right? Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or Sinai. What's Oreb? Oreb is the mountain in Israel, Horeb. Or Oreb or of Sinai. Milton's favorite word is or. Didst inspire that shepherd. Who's that shepherd? Yeah? Okay, Moses. Yeah, I mean, that's what it's going to be. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Different muse here, right? You see that Milton is obviously saying to Virgil and Homer, you did that already, but what I'm going to do is much better. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Who's that? Jews, right? And here is talk about chutzpah. This is the most chutzpah-dick line in all of English poetry. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Milton is incorporating the Bible into his text. Or, if Sion Hill delight thee more, what's Sion Hill? Har Zion, Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Or Silo is brook, Shiloh, that flowed fast by the oracle of God. Where do you usually find oracles? Right. It's here Milton. I'm just Milton a ton of different things here. One of the things he's doing is taking an earlier classical tradition and incorporating it into his poem. So Milton's Paradise Lost, somebody used the term before, is a supersessionist poem, right? It's superseding not only, as we'll see, the Jews, but it's also superseding Virgil and Homer. English culture is the best ever, and my poem is the best ever. He really thinks of this. He really thinks of this. Fast, and he's almost right. Fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian Mount. The Aeonian Mount, of course, is in Greece, and his poem is going to soar over it, while it pursues things unattempted, yet in prose or rhyme. I'm going to write something that nobody else has ever written before. Before all temples, and chiefly thou, O Spirit. Here we're getting back to the Christian stuff. Chiefly thou, O Spirit. Before we said in Homer and Virgil, there were 9 classical muses, goddesses. Who's Milton's muse? And chiefly thou, O Spirit. He's a Christian, remember? It's the Holy Spirit. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. What's Milton doing here with these lines? Does prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. What's better? The particular building that was built in Jerusalem, made of rocks and stones and marble. What's better than that? What's happening really with Luther and Milton and Donne and Shakespeare, of course, is kind of the invention of subjectivity. I mean, obviously it's Christian, but there's a real emphasis on interiority here. Right? What's more important is not the external world. What's more important is the internal world. Was present and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss and made it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine what is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence. I want to just focus on these lines. Thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sats brooding on the vast abyss. Who is he calling out to here? I mean, this is a continuation of, and chiefly thou, O Spirit. And that Spirit, says Milton, thou, you, from the first was present, at the very beginning, at the beginning of Genesis. And with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss, and made it pregnant. What is Milton referring to in Genesis? I think I have it. Is there something like that in Genesis? right? Here's the Hebrew.
Okay.
It says,
sorry.
With this. Yeah. So the Hebrew, V'haaretz hayta tov v'vo, v'choshech al panei atom, v'ruach Elokim merachepet al panei hamayim. And does anybody know Hebrew here? Some people, yeah? How would you translate that?
Ruach Elokim merachepet. Yeah?
God is floating over the face of the water.
Right. So ruach is the key term here, right? And ruach can mean wind. I've seen it translated as wind. Now
yeah. Well, sure.
I mean, Milton is obviously going with that, right? But I see that maybe some of your responses, maybe some of you had Christian educations, are spirit, right? My students' response is, what? Because they are familiar with the text and their understanding of the text from their tradition. But what Milton is doing here is the same thing that we
saw Paul doing, that is taking the Christian text, taking the Jewish text and rendering it Christian. So much so that when we go back and read the earlier line about that shepherd, who is that shepherd now after we've read this 27 lines?
It's Jesus, right?
Which really transforms the whole idea of chosen seed. It's almost like Luther is hiding there, or Paul is hiding there inside of Milton's story. The thing that's really incredible about Paradise Lost, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, is that if interpretive work needed to be done on the Old Testament, as we were suggesting earlier, Augustine and Paul do that as interpretation, meaning they interpret the text. Milton rewrites the text, incorporating all of that Protestant interpretation. It's almost like, if this is resonant for you, a kind of Christian midrash. A midrash is a rabbinic tale, a rabbinic interpretive story. And it's almost like Milton is taking the Old Testament and then rewriting it, doing exactly what you guys automatically said in relationship to what I was, when I referred to the chosen seed. You already had those interpretations in place. So Milton has them in place, and he tells the story over.
I think this is shepherd being Moses.
Well, so for sure.
It's definitely, I mean, it's, I would have thought first of all, it's a pastoral shepherd, somebody who would go out to one of the gardens with sheep.
Then it's Moses, but ultimately it's Christ. Right. Okay. No, I would not argue with you that the simple meaning is Moses. Of course it's Moses, right? Of course it's Moses. But when after I read 26 lines, I think I see more than I thought I saw at the beginning. Okay. Let's see. Okay. I mean, so all of these texts really, starting with our image of church and synagogue, express some kind of relationship between the church and the Jews. I live in Israel now, and years ago I went to Berlin. And I had to decide, like, am I going to do the Jewish concentration camp tour, or am I going to hear symphonies, right? I decided to hear symphonies in the end, right? And I thought of those two things as being really separate. But really, the history of Europe is inseparable from anti-Semitism. It bases itself on it in some sense. Because as we're seeing here, all of later Christian representations of Christianity have to come to terms with the Old Testament. It's always there. And the Jew is a reminder. Luther found this reminder so problematic that he wanted to burn their shuls, to burn their synagogues. Because the Jews are a persistent reminder of another perspective, of another way. So I think at the heart of Christianity is this tremendous anxiety in relationship to Judaism. And anxiety can manifest itself in various forms. And it can manifest itself, For example, in the anger and violence of Luther, which is in contrast to what we saw in that image from the Strasbourg Cathedral, and that same kind of violence that's present in Luther obviously gets expressed in the 20th century as well. I think on Wikipedia it says the Jews and their lies did not lead up to the Nazis, but was just a part of the traditions of medieval anti-Semitism. So I don't know what some historian will probably have to say. What are the continuities between those things, between medieval anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of the Nazis? Just changing gears now to 20th century anti-Semitism and 21st century anti-Semitism, but still focusing on exceptionalism and the problem of Jewish exceptionalism. So there's a literary critic named George Steiner, absolutely brilliant guy, who gave some lectures at Yale in 1970. He was responding to lectures that T.S. Eliot had given earlier called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. And in 1970, Steiner gives lectures at Yale called subtitled Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. It's called In Bluebeard's Castle. Steiner, I think, was compelled to do it again because Eliot is writing Notes Towards the Definition of Culture in the 40s and makes no mention of the Jews and no mention of the Holocaust. And Steiner says we have to go back to that. And he goes back to this and provides a reading of anti-Semitism as, again, a protest against exceptionalism. Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
The whole? Okay.
Let's go back. Let's go to our sheets. We're skipping Spinoza. Read that in your spare time. Right. Okay. That intent takes us to the heart of certain instabilities in the fabric of Jewish culture, of Western culture, in the relations between instinctual and religious life. You see what he's doing is inflected by Freud, obviously. Hitler's jibe that conscience is a Jewish invention provides a clue. He goes on, and we'll keep that distinction between instinctual and religious life. So it's a terrifying article that he writes, a book. The Holocaust is a reflex, the more complete for being long inhibited of natural sensory consciousness, of instinctual, polytheistic, and animistic needs. Europe has been repressed for hundreds of years, and it really wants to express its animist and polytheistic desires. In the Holocaust, there was both a lunatic retribution, a lashing out against intolerable pressures of vision, and a large measure of self-mutilation. For Steiner, the Holocaust represents Europe killing itself. By killing the Jews, by killing their conscience, they were destroying itself. The secular, materialist, warlike community of modern Europe sought to extirpate from itself, from its own inheritance, archaic, now ridiculously obsolete, but somehow inextinguishable carriers of the ideal. The carriers of the ideal being the Jews. Again, the reference points here are not so much theological. Europe is described as secular, warlike, and materialist. And yet, there's still that unignorable presence of the Jews. They are the carriers of the ideal. In the Nazi idiom of vermin and sanitation, there is a brusque insight into the infectious nature of morality. You see, he's a great writer, right? A brusque insight into the infectious nature of morality. And according to Steiner, Europe wants to inoculate itself from morality. What's wrong with morality? Well, in Steiner's register, we'll talk about 21st century register in a bit. In Steiner's register, morality is the thing that doesn't allow one's animist and polytheistic and irrational instincts to express themselves. Monotheism at Sinai, primitive Christianity, messianic socialism, these are the three supreme moments in which Western culture is presented with what Ibsen termed the claims of the ideal. These are the three stages profoundly interrelated through which Western consciousness is forced to experience the blackmail of transcendence. Unceasingly, the blackmail of perfection has hammered at the confused, mundane, egotistical frame of common, instinctual behavior, like a shrilling note in the inner ear. Men are neither saints nor ascetics. Their imaginings are gross. Ordinarily, their sense of the future is the next milestone. But the insistence of the ideal continued with a terrible, tactless force. I find this particularly haunting given what's happening in Europe today, meaning a lot of what we've taken for granted for decades and a few generations, I'm speaking really as an American now, the existence of democracy really seems to be challenged by what's happening all over the world. Eastern Europe, with the kind of return of demagoguery. And of course, when demagogues return, they allow for the expression of these irrational forces. A friend of mine said that our grandparents would never have taken anything for granted in America, and they never did, because for them, all they knew was a history of violence against them. It's only contemporary Americans, American Jews, who are like, what? You know, everything's great. And everything has been great. But here Steiner is bringing out this sense of there are these irrational forces, and democracy is a very delicate experiment. That's my commentary. The mechanism is simple but primordial. We hate most those who hold out to us a goal, an ideal, a visionary promise, which even though we have stretched our muscles to the utmost, we cannot reach, which slips again and again, just out of range of our racked fingers. Yet, and this is crucial, which remains profoundly desirable, which we cannot reject because we fully acknowledge its supreme value. In his exasperating strangeness, his exceptionalism, in his acceptance of suffering as a part of a covenant with the absolute, the Jew became, as it were, the bad conscience of Western history. As Hamlet says, conscience does make cowards of us all. And in a sense, that's what Steiner is saying in relationship to Europe. It made them cowards in regard to expressing their deepest desires and irrational lusts. In him, the abandonment of spiritual and moral perfection, the abandonments of spiritual and moral perfection, the hypocrisies of an established mundane religiosity, the absence of a disappointed, potentially vengeful God were kept alive and visible. So the Jews are the carriers of the ideal. It's interesting that for Steiner, it's not only Moses, also Jesus, also Marx, and to some extent, I think also Freud, that they are the carriers of the ideal.